Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Sheffield and ultimately guide some of that conversation.
All right. Thank you very much. And it's great to be back. I hope everybody's well. I'm trying to adjust here, get my camera right. So forgive me. First of all, Sheffield needs no introduction, but this is a great topic, monumental confusion, and dealing with the Stone Mountain Park and the Confederacy and monuments. And it brought back some memories for me. I came to Atlanta in 1974 to Morehouse, and the first thing I was told was, do not go to Stone Mountain, period. So when I actually bought a house in Stone Mountain in 1984, I did it for two reasons. I liked the area, but two, it was kind of like moving somewhere I told I couldn't. But I was also scared, nervous. And then in the late 80s, Carla and I were coming down Main Street, downtown Stone Mountain. And this is when the Klan was still having their meetings at Stone Mountain Park or over at one of the other parks. And I came within 6-7 feet with a Klansman and his that's when they wore the black robe and he had his hood and everything. And I remember so much that feeling I got being that close to a Klansman. It just shocked me. How can somebody hate that much? So Sheffield, thank you so much for doing this. So I'm going to introduce Sheffield Hale real quick. He's the president and CEO of the Atlanta History Center. And prior to joining Atlanta History Center in 2012, he served as the chief counsel of the American Cancer Society. And he was a partner practicing corporate law in the firm of Kilpatrick. And also, he's done so many things. He's been on numerous boards. He's been on a ton of boards. He also got his bachelor's from the University of Georgia, so he's a Bulldog. And then he went up there to Virginia and got his law degree in 1985. He's a member of the American Law Institute. But most importantly, Sheffield's my friend. And that's what means more to me than anything. He's a good man. His heart is good. And he does things for the right reasons. And I'm proud to have him as a friend and a fellow Rotarian and a club member. Welcome, Sheffield Hale.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Classic introduction from our past president. So I'm here today to let you know that the Stone Mountain issue is coming like a freight train at us, just like the flag was a couple of years ago. And since it's the day before the election and Bill Hennigan asked me to talk about something non-controversial, I thought Stone Mountain was a perfect topic. And really what we're talking about is the unfinished business from 2001. If you'll remember that year, Governor Barnes spearheaded the change in the Georgia state flag, where we were under threat of boycotts and action and embarrassment at that time. And while it doomed his reelection chances, it was really a gift to the citizens of Georgia, and it moved us forward both ethically and economically. We now have to have the same collective will to address the issues of Stone Mountain and the carving. And I want to bring up these issues and educate this group about what the real history of it is before we end up in a shooting war or sometime where, you're not able to absorb the information. Now, you may not remember it after tomorrow anyway, but there will be a recording for you later. So the history of the mountain is clear. Governor Marvin Griffin promised to purchase the mountain and complete the Confederate carving at a campaign rally during his governor's race in 1954. Just 57 days after the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, he said that he would buy the mountain in his next administration and finish the carving. There are no coincidences here. He has also said that he was going to protect segregation. That was the clear theme of the 1954 election. The Stone Mountain carving and then the 1956 state flag, which he did change to the Confederate flag, are the two most prominent examples in the country of using Confederate symbolism as a rallying point to resist integration. Now, to talk about Stone Mountain's future and why I'm calling it the unfinished business of the 1956 state flag, you really need to understand its past. And this past is actually much more recent than you probably realize. Now, the Stone Mountain relief may be carved in stone, but it isn't some ancient monument like the Buddhas of Baiman Valley. They were destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban, or even the Temple of Baal in Palmyra, Syria, built in 32 AD and destroyed for spite by ISIS in 2015. It's not an ancient monument. But for the record, I'm not suggesting that its use would require it to be blown up either, though, as I will show you later, there is precedent for that. So, for some context, in 1973, when the carving was finished, my favorite TV show was MASH, and my voice was changing. And here I am. I clearly have not aged at all. So the time is right for change at Stone Mountain Park. The legislation establishing the park was created by the state government at times specifically and intentionally to oppose integration and equality for Black Americans. This legislation establishing the park for that purpose is still on the books. And I don't think that any Georgia legislature or governor would support that stance today, at least in public. So I think we have an opportunity here, if we really understand why the carving was established and why the park was established Confederate memorial, to do something about it. And the controversy really isn't even about the lost cause of the Confederacy. It has nothing to do with General Lee, Stonewall Jackson, or Jeff Davis. The carving on the mountain is all about this state's political resistance to integration post-Brown versus Board of Education, period. That's what we're talking about. Now, if you want to have an appropriate carving on the mountain, it would be the smiling face of Marvin Griffin. There he is signing the flag legislation. Or perhaps have it accompanied by Lester Maddox's son brandishing an axe handle and our future governor carrying a gun. Perhaps that should be on the mountain instead, because that's what we're talking about. Now, it's time to get this argument down where the goats can get at it and have an honest, evidence-based supported history. Let's listen to what the politicians said when they purchased the mountain. After that is on the table, then we can have a productive conversation about what to do about the carving. The 1956 flag, the purchase and designation of Stone Mountain Park as a Confederate memorial, and the resumption of the carving are part and parcel of the same spasmodic reaction to integration. It's been a generation, almost exactly 20 years, since we dealt with the first spasm, the flag. It's time we deal with the second half of the issue. With the facts laid out before us, I think we have the opportunity for a conversation. And as an old UGA coach used to say, finish the drill. And as our current coach says, attack the day and come up with a solution together. So let's go back and let's first start and put Stone Mountain in context with all the Confederate monuments that exist. And we can talk about them and see how Stone Mountain fits into the context. This chart, which is done by the Southern Poverty Law Center, shows activity around monuments, both around courthouse squares, street names, and buildings, and related to the Confederacy and when they arose. The first wave you'll see at the beginning were the funereal monuments. As you'll recall, the South suffered great loss in the Civil War in terms of 25% of its Southern white men of military age were killed in the war. So there was a lot to mourn, and there were a lot of people to bury, and you saw a lot of that early on. And so you would have monuments made up of obelisks in cemeteries, for example. The perfect example of that is Oakland Cemetery with this 1874 obelisk. Then, after that period, you started to have the Jim Crow period. That's when the Southern whites took back over the government from Reconstruction and began to institute segregation, Jim Crow laws, and to propagate the lost cause message and the myth of the lost cause. That occurred between the 1890s and 1930s, and you can see the first effort for Stone Mountain carving, and we'll get to that exact history in a minute, was at really the height of that effort. And it responded to that need to show who was in charge and to set the tone that the South may have lost, but they've won and they're now in charge. It's a very complicated theory, the lost cause myth. Essentially, if you want to boil it down, the lost cause comes up with every reason for the war they can think of other than slavery. They will even say, well, it's tariffs, it's about the economy, it's defending home and hearth. There's some truth in all of that, but the precipitating factor and the key factor behind it was the war, was slavery, and but we don't need to have that debate today. We can have that in a whole nother conversation. And that's like a lot about what I'm talking today. We're hitting across the surface. I'm trying to hit the key points about Stone Mountain, and then we can talk in questions about some of these other issues if you want to bring them up, or I can suggest reading for you later. And then the second wave you see there is immediately after Brown versus Board of Education, and that was in response to integration. And Brown versus Board of Education. If you look on the chart very carefully, there's hardly anything going on in 1954, and then immediately thereafter, there's a whole reaction and throughout the South of additional monuments. And the Stone Mountain carving is probably the perfect example of that. And that's why it's so fraught. So why don't we go back and hit the history of the Stone Mountain carving from the beginning and then take it through to the current day. So first of all, the idea was to create a Confederate memorial. There came up by Helen Plain, who was the president of the United Daughters of Confederacy in Atlanta. She was a Confederate widow, and she proposed to put a bust of Robert E. Lee on the mountain. Then in 1915, Birth of a Nation comes out. Everything changes. The Klan is inspired, and others are inspired at the same time to resurrect the Klan. And Plain suggests that, well, in addition to Robert E. Lee, probably they should add members of the Klan because they, quote, saved us from Negro domination and carpetbag rule. So you can see the whole ethos going along when the mountain for the first carving was proposed. Then the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial Association was incorporated. This is different from the current Stone Mountain Memorial Association, which is a state memorial association. This was a private one that no longer exists. And then Gutson Borglum, who was later carved Stone Mount Rushmore, was hired as a carver. So this was the beginning. So here he is in his studio with the plaster maquette. Borglum got crossways with Ku Klux Klan leadership issues and ended up being fired and forced out. He had already carved the face of Lee on the mountain, and he had this maquette which he destroyed and fled the area. They ended up hiring Augustus Lukeman to follow it. And here's the precedent that I've talked about. They blasted Lee's head off the mountain in 1925. Again, I'm not suggesting that the carving be blown up, but as a lawyer, I must stipulate that there is precedent. So Lukeman there for a period of 3 years started working on the carving, and there you see him in front of looking up Robert E. Lee's nose in 1928. And in 1928, there was a big celebration, very patriotic celebration, unveiling Lee's head. And then you can see in the next slide, Robert E. Lee's descendant, Robert E. Lee IV, at the unveiling ceremony, carrying both an American flag and a Confederate flag. That's interesting because this is the area of reconciliation and trying to reconcile the North and the South among the whites, that is. And that's a whole nother topic of conversation, and it would be another lecture just on that, but you see it here quite graphically. And then the Depression comes in and the carving is stopped. And here's the way it sits for 36 years. Just with the Lee's head on the mountain. Here's a shot of it from the 1940s as well. This is the state of the carving all the way up until 1964. Now, to go back to hit this clearly on the first effort, the Ku Klux Klan involvement was significant. And as you can see, Sam Venable, who owned the mountain, was a member of the Klan, and he's the one who permitted that reformation of the Klan on the mountain, and held the mountain and gave them a license to use the mountain for their events for as long as he lived. And that happened until 1958 when it was purchased by the state of Georgia. You also see Hollins Randolph was the president of the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial Association. He was also their lawyer, and he was a member of the Klan. Look at the name below his, Nathan Bedford Forrest, grandson of the Confederate general, was secretary and the chief fundraiser for the effort. So they continued to use the mountain. You can see here in the 1950s, they were still, they were going strong. Take a look at the flag here on the mountain. Really interesting. The American flag. This was a pro-American organization in their view. The use of the Confederate flag came a little bit later, really after the Dixiecrats, but mainly after the Brown versus Board of Education. You see the Confederate battle flag in use. Again, a subject for another conversation. So, monuments to massive resistance. They were out of money, and they tried it several times to resurrect the carving, and they had different models made for the carving, but nothing happened. There was no funding, and the war intervened, and there was no impetus to do it. But the history of the carving was triggered, as I said before, by the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, and it started up again. And again, 57 days after Brown versus Board, Marvin Griffin at a rally said that he would buy the mountain and restart the carving. He also attacked his opponents, saying they had deviated, procrastinated, or run out on the segregation issue, and he promised he wouldn't do so. He pledged to buy Stone Mountain, and he did it. The first thing he did, and he was elected governor that year in 1956, they passed a law attempting to nullify the Brown versus Board decision, and the same year, they incorporate the Confederate battle flag into the state flag. That's how all of these are related. In 1958, he finally gets around to purchasing the mountain. And here's what he said about it. Completion of the memorial will be of everlasting benefit to the present generation and all future citizens of this state and the Southland. Now, when attempts are being made to destroy our very way of life, it will serve as a rallying point for all of us who believe in preserving the ideals for which our forefathers fought. Now, in case you have forgotten, our way of life, in this case, refers to segregation. And ideals for which our forefathers fought refers to lost cause mythology. Now, I will conditionally agree with a couple of aspects of his comments. The carving has served as a rallying point for people who continue to share his same beliefs, the Klan, the neo-Nazis, and some certain alt-right groups. And I also believe that the purchase of the mountain and not the carving is of everlasting benefit to future generations. And boy, if you've been out to the mountain recently and you've seen the generations that are there today, I believe they are a lot different from what he had in mind. I guess that's karma for you. So during the next several years, the state of Georgia and the Stone Mountain Memorial Association continued feasibility studies and debates on what the carving should look like. One proposal included a massive Confederate flag using the carving as the center star. Just think of the mess we would have if that had happened. The civil rights movement in the meantime continued along, and with violence by whites against blacks, as you can see in Anniston, Alabama, and others. So to really dig into Stone Mountain's identity as a massive resistance monument, let's take a look at the timeline during the mid-1960s. Only a week before the Stone Mountain carving finally resumed, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 3 days before Martin Luther King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, the Atlanta newspapers lauded the completion of Stonewall Jackson's head on the side of the mountain. While the torso and horse of Stonewall Jackson were meticulously carved into the mountain, John Lewis was being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and several civil rights activists were murdered in Alabama and Mississippi. In 1966, as carvers fretted over the fact that Jefferson Davis appeared to be riding a mule because of the size of the ears on the horse, James Meredith was shot in rural Mississippi on his solo march, protesting the lack of voter access. He survived the attack, and the march was finished by nearly 15,000 people on his behalf. And the contrast is stark, if not ironic, to say the least. And it takes the modern cliche, tone deaf, to a whole new level. Now, the carving itself was not completed until 1973. Here it is in 1966, still lacking much of the work, torso, at least half of it wasn't done. Comes 1970, and we're going to get to the issue that was in the question before the meeting. Carving was unveiled in 1970 at that time. Richard Nixon was supposed to be there in a mere 3 days before he dropped out because of the controversy and sent as his replacement Spiro Agnew. Now, there were a couple of disagreements about this dedication that came out. First of all, there was an Emory professor who violently objected to Spiro Agnew coming to be a speaker because he thought that he was anti-intellectual against colleges, which he was, and that would have been an affront to the memory of Robert E. Lee, who, of course, restarted what became Washington Lee University. And then also the Klan, they protested the inclusion of Reverend William Holmes Borders on the podium. In the dedication ceremony, he was given an invocation. Obviously, what had happened was the organizers were trying to dodge the race issue and the issue of slavery and the Civil War, and so they invited Reverend Borders from the Wheat Street Baptist Church to come. But the beautiful thing is that the Klan protested that, and what they said, and they boycotted the event, which worked out for everybody. But James Venable, a descendant of the family which owned the mountain, and a leader of the Klan, said in remarkable candor and actually breaking from the Lost Cause Convention that the war wasn't about slavery, said, "The war was fought over the question of slavery, and it is improper for a member of his race to take part in the program." Wow. Out of the mouths of Klansmen. So here we have Spiro Agnew arriving in Marine 2 on the day of the ceremony. You can see the American and Confederate flag flying above him. Throughout the Agnew addressed a crowd of about 10,000. They'd expected 100,000, but they were no shows. He was introduced by Senator Herman Talmadge and sat on the stage with segregationist Governor Lester Maddox. A clue here, the mountain was dedicated under Lester Maddox, and for all those who picked Jimmy Carter, they're correct. It was finished technically in 1973 during the Carter administration. So congratulations to all of you. So the Stone Mountain carving was completed and dedicated as a memorial to the Confederacy, codified by law that was enacted as a law that was an attack on judicially mandated integration. So that's what they did. That's what it is. So if we just listen to them, sometimes these historical actors will just come out and say what they mean. And don't believe me, believe them. So to take this back to the beginning of the presentation and to remind us that the carving is not that old, here's an old surveillance photo of Dave Moody and his Morehouse fraternity at the Swan House in 1976, a mere 3 years after the Stone Mountain carving was completed. Past President Dave, back to you, and I look forward to taking yours and questions anyone else has.
Wow, that was some kind of presentation. Man, I'm just kind of been shaking here as you spoke, because it just hurts, to even think that kind of hate because of someone's race could just still be prevalent today. But we'll get through it. And yes, can you put that picture back up real quick of us at the Swan House? All right, folks, this is a interesting story. My fraternity from Morehouse, Omega Psi Phi fraternity, one of my buddies knew that the Swan House was part of the History Center. It was open to the public. And we were all pretty nervous to even go over there, going off Paces Ferry and going into Buckhead. But we said, you know what? It's public. We're going to take a picture there. And it was quite interesting. The staff really didn't know what to say to us. But all of us were pretty nervous. We didn't know if we were going to get the police called on us or not, even though it was a public place and open to the public. And we took that picture. And a few years later, I went back and stood and took a picture in that same spot 40 years later, just to remind myself how far we have come, and but how far we still need to go. So Sheffield, thank you for just a great presentation. I got a couple questions for you, and then we'll open it up to our membership. Sheffield, what do you say to people who think that the Confederacy is part of their heritage and that Stone Mountain's carving represents that?
Well, I think I've shown in this talk that it was really not about the Confederacy. It's about using the Confederate icons to resist integration. but the issue of Confederate heritage comes up a lot, and I like to talk about that. I've got Confederate ancestors myself, and it's just a part of just is. And the heritage history issue, I like to say that heritage is history with all the bad parts left out. Okay, and that's what people want to remember, and that's what goes with a lot of these heritage groups. They want to remember the valor, they want to remember the sacrifice, they want to remember things that came up that they claim were the reasons for the war that may differ from the actual reasons, and forget the issue about slavery. And that lost cause mentality came out, and people believe it because that's what they were taught in school. That's what their parents said. That's what teachers, books said. The United Arts Confederacy was the best propaganda group I've ever seen in terms of infiltrating that into every aspect of history in this country, including in the North. Okay, that lost cause, the war was not about slavery, it was about everything but, is something that is in history textbooks. It's even today in if you look at the immigration test, the immigration nationalization test, there are two causes of the Civil War that are correct answers. One is slavery and the other is economics. So it's still alive today. And of course, everything is complicated, but that's why they believe it's the people that they believed. And what we need to do with this mountain is say, this is not about that. So we don't even have to have that conversation about Lee, like I said before. Let's talk about why they did it at the time. And it was all about resistance to integration. Had nothing to do with Lee.
You kind of answered my next question, which was, why is it so hard for white Southerners to accept? So I think you kind of answered that. But I'm going to go to the next question. How does state law fit into all this?
Well, the state law, and here's the real issue that I think about this monument. It's not really about the carving first. It's about the law that protects or designates the park as a Confederate memorial. That's the part I think is most troubling, and that's the part I would think the legislature could fix. And if you start with that, then you can start and move that and understand the history, then you can figure out what to do with the carving. And so the state law stipulates that it's a memorial essentially to the heroes of the Confederacy. And there's another law that protects the monument itself that actually came out of the law that changed the flag in 2001. It's a compromise. They got half of the job done, but then they used that compromise to protect Stone Mountain as a way to get legislatures to vote for the flag change.
All right, just got a couple more questions, and we'll check to see if we have any from our members. What would you do if someone asked you?
What would I do?
Yep.
Well, that's a dangerous question. What I would do is first change the law, make it into just a state park. That's what it is. People have taken it over and are using it as if it's a state park. It's not being used as a Confederate memorial. You can just look at the people who are there. That's not why they're there. You see that every day, don't you, Dave?
Yes, I do. And I go to the mountain often, working out. So yes.
Yeah, it's like the United Nations out there.
Yes,
right?
it is.
It is one of the most diverse places on the planet.
It really is.
And they're all walking underneath that carving. I would change the street names. I would take all the Confederate related issues out. That's the easy low-hanging fruit. I would then take the museum that's at the bottom of the carving and turn it into a museum about the lost cause, about these monuments generally, and how this one fits in, and just tell the truth. The problem is you're not telling the truth. You go in that museum now, they have one little square about that the Klan used to have events. It says dark history. And it's on a huge wall. That's it in the entire museum. There's a whole bunch on Helen Plain. There's a whole bunch. It's not a bad museum. It just doesn't tell the truth. And that to me would be simple. This is the only Confederate monument in the country where you can just tell the truth.
Okay, here's a couple questions from our members. First question is, what is the next step with respect to the Stone Mountain carving and the museum at the bottom?
Well, the next step, it would be easy if they, first of all, you have to get the Stone Mountain Memorial Association to agree that they're going to have to change the purpose. Now, it's the governor's call, right, in the legislatures. And then you can have a new interpretation in the museum. And that would be the first thing to do. And there's a group out there right now working on it called the Stone Mountain Action Coalition. and I've been talking with them, and they're seem to be a reasonable group, wanting to encourage dialogue and how to move this issue along. I believe this issue is coming at us. I think we need to get ahead of it. I think we need to have a Georgia way with it, like we did with the flag. We shouldn't be that big of an issue. I mean, one of the issues right now is that the vendor in the park is pulling out. It's a really good time because it's not family friendly. People aren't going to are not having events in the park. They're not having conventions at the convention center at the hotel. And so the state will have to take it over, because I don't see anybody in their right mind who would go into a Confederate memorial in this day and age to operate a theme park.
Okay, next question from a member is, wouldn't removing the monument be a strong endorsement of racial justice?
See, that is, it's possible. And one of the things I like to say is, I don't like to take anything off the table, because I think there ought to be a discussion about it. That's the reason I put up that slide and said, it's been blown up before, it could happen again. A lot of people don't realize that. But that's not something I lead with. I think we need to have a discussion about what should happen to it. Could it be contextualized? Could there be counter monuments? Could it be used? Maybe it's the last Confederate monument in the whole country, and it has a museum at the bottom of it, and it is new and kitschy and all of that. Maybe we keep it for that reason. I don't know. I think that's a decision that the citizens of the state need to make. It's a state monument, and I think we need to focus on the real issues, and that could certainly be one of them.
Okay, another question from one of our members is, where does the city of Atlanta and the mayor come into play here, if at all?
They don't, except I guess as moral cheerleaders. The issue for Atlanta is economic. This could be the center of the next boycott. Right. It's a state, it's just like the flag. It's a state-sponsored endorsement of this Confederate mythology. And you're seeing these issues with monuments around the country. There's no monument that's bigger or badder than this one. And so it affects the state, it affects the Chamber of Commerce, should really be focused on it, about being able to continue to attract conventions, sporting events. And it's not whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, it just is. And so it's something we need to focus on.
Okay. I got another question for you. And I think this is an important one that people have been asking. Who are the groups currently advocating for changing the Stone Mountain Park?
Right now, the main one I'm worried about interested in, is the Stone Mountain Action Coalition. I've been talking to them. They've been trying to engage in a productive way with the Stone Mountain Memorial Association to come up with ideas. And they have lots of ideas about what they could do with the park. But what they're really looking for is an effort to draw those ideas from the public out. And, ideas, everything they've proposed, from letting the monument essentially go to ruin, let nature take over, to counter monuments, to additional large monuments made around the mountain. Obviously, there have been other proposals, like Andrew Young's proposal for a bell on top of it to reflect the I Have a Dream speech reference. There are lots of ways to go, but the first step is that the state needs to recognize it has a problem. It needs to take the Confederate memorial status away from it and then turn it into a park that's for everybody. Everybody's using it, but that's what we need to do. And then we can come up with all kinds of solutions. And one could be in 5, 10, 20 years, the carving is gone. Or it could be, maybe that's worse, maybe we keep it so we always remember this presentation, the facts in the presentation I just gave you, and how crazy things can be. Okay.
Well, Cannon, do we have any more? I think that was all of our questions. So with that being said, Cannon, I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
Well, both of you stay on the screen. It does look like that's it for the questions. But first of all, Sheffield, thank you for what is a humbling and chilling recount of how, in many respects, it's a symbol of hate and integration, even in our modern times. I always kind of, from my perspective, I thought it was old history, but in many respects, it is not. And so, maybe just a simple question, is there any way that this can move from being a symbol of hate and division to one of and even a rallying point of unity and good. Can that symbol ever become something like that? And I ask both of you that just for your opinions.
You know, that it's hard. It's hard for me to imagine that it becomes that. I think it'd become an educational symbol of what, you know, we need to be careful about and how we got to where we are. I think it'd be used as that. I don't think it's necessarily inherently going to be a positive statement. If it were removed, there are a lot of people who would see that as extremely positive. Others would see that as an attack. So it just depends on your point of view. And I think that's why we need to have this conversation and get the real history out on the table before we come to what the conclusion should be, and get people closer together as to what the reality is of this situation.
Yeah, I agree definitely with Sheffield. I think one of the biggest things is getting the history out, getting the knowledge, you know, getting the truth out. And I think that changes a lot of people's way of thinking. You know, like for me, one of the ideas of having a freedom bell at the top of Stone Mountain is Dr. Martin Luther King mentioned in his speech. So I think it has to be truth. Then I think it has to be some things done that kind of says, we're not going back, we're going forward, and this is how we go forward. So there's work to be done, but the first most important thing is people understand and know the truth of why this really was done.
And I think we're at a good inflection point. I mean, because of all of the focus on monuments, the fact that the vendor's leaving, you know, if people often do things for the right reasons because of money, and you know, and maybe it's time that people focus on it and then said, oh, you're right, it's not about the Confederacy, it's about this other thing, so we can change it and move on. I may be Pollyanna with that, but that's what I think we should do.
Well, and by symbol of good, I mean, I agree with both of you, right? It would never be one of good, but it's one of never forget, right? And so there it become a rallying cry of like, this is the biggest monument. It, you know, it tells an ugly story, and let's never forget. And Dave, like you were saying, if there's a way to put something around it that celebrates progress in future so that we don't forget, you know, and both of you are saying, tell the truth. I mean, you know, something that would tell the truth is so important.
Hey, Shay, can I add something, Cannon?
Please.
It's kind of like, you know, we were fortunate enough to build the Cyclorama project for Atlanta History Center. And I told Sheffield that project meant so much to me it was more than just construction. It was about what that painting stood for. It was the Battle of Atlanta, the Civil War. Here was an African-American company building the building that when this war was fighting, if someone had thought someone who looked like me would own a business and be building what we were building on Pace's Ferry, you know, never would have happened. So those are the kind of things we got to do to help change and make things better. And we just can't give up and quit. But some days you just get tired because you feel like, you know, will it ever get better?
Well, maybe just last question to wrap up then. You know, both of you have pointed out how now is the time for change. You know, it's building. And in some context, it's coming, right? It's going to be a coming conversation. Let's get in front of it. And you alluded to it a moment ago, Sheffield, but maybe just final thoughts on what is a good way to begin to organize and own this conversation as a community?
Well, I think it needs to be a Georgia discussion. I don't think it should be an Atlanta discussion or necessarily just a Stone Mountain discussion, because this is a statewide monument. And this is an opportunity to reach across the aisle to deal with an issue that shouldn't be an issue in the 21st century, that is going to be an economic threat to the state, and obviously an embarrassment to the state. And if we can get people just focused on the right history and not going off on this lost cause tangent, it has nothing to do with that. You can stipulate Lee's out of the picture. Let's talk about what they did in 1954 and when it was finished in 1973. Let's talk about those issues and get that on the table and see if we can get the legislators to focus on the economics and the reality today.
Well, Dave, any final thoughts from you? Or
no, I'm good.
All right. Well, both of you, thank you very much for bringing this up for just a special program. And this will be available by replay. so others will be able to view it too. And Sheffield, thank you for helping us to organize our thoughts around what's going to be an important issue that as a state we can start to get around and own.
You're welcome. Let's get after it.
Let's get after it. And Dave, thank you for
all right. Thanks for
steering our
having me.
discussion.